Grace Whitman sat alone at a corner table at Bellamy's, a candlelit bistro dressed for Christmas Eve, watching the door for the third time in 20 minutes. Her blind date, arranged through a mutual friend after 2 years of Grace avoiding dating apps entirely, had walked in, made eye contact, gone pale, and walked back out without a word 11 minutes earlier. Grace was still staring at her untouched water glass when a small voice beside her table asked a question that made every other sound in the restaurant disappear. "Are you the lady my dad was supposed to have dinner with? Can you be my new mom instead?" Grace looked down into the face of a girl no older than 6, snow still melting on her mittens. Grace was 34, a pediatric hospice nurse at Marigold Children's Care, a role she'd held for 9 years after leaving a hospital nursing track that paid $31,000 more annually, a decision her parents still occasionally questioned at holiday dinners. She hadn't dated seriously since a 4-year relationship ended when her fiancé told her, almost apologetically, that being with someone who spent her days surrounded by dying children made him feel like he was always competing with grief. She'd stopped explaining her job to dates after that. She'd started instead simply expecting them to leave. What Grace didn't yet know was that Marcus Chen, 38, hadn't fled because of her. He'd frozen the moment he saw her face under the restaurant's string lights. Not from disinterest, but recognition he couldn't immediately place. A feeling like déjà vu with teeth. He'd stepped outside to catch his breath and call his babysitter, only to learn she'd had a family emergency and couldn't watch his daughter, Lily, who he'd left with her for what was supposed to be his first dinner out in 14 months. Lily hadn't stayed with the backup sitter either. She'd walked the 4 blocks from her grandmother's apartment to the restaurant alone, in the dark, on Christmas Eve, because she'd overheard her father on the phone say the words, "I don't think I can do this," and at 6 years old concluded he meant the date, not the babysitting crisis. She'd seen Grace through the window sitting alone and made a decision entirely her own before anyone could stop her. Grace knelt to Lily's eye level, her hospice training taking over before her own shock could catch up. The careful, unhurried tone she used with children who asked questions no one wanted to answer honestly. "What makes you think I'd make a good mom?" she asked gently, buying time. Lily's answer stopped her cold. "You have the same necklace my mom used to wear, the little bird one." Grace's hand went instinctively to the small enamel wren pinned at her collar, a piece she'd worn every day for 3 years, one she'd never told anyone the real story behind. The wren pin wasn't sentimental jewelry. It was a gift from a former patient's mother, a woman named Sophia Chen, who had died of stage 4 pancreatic cancer under Grace's care at Marigold 14 months earlier, at just 36 years old. Sophia had given Grace the pin during her final week, saying only, "Birds find their way back to the same nest, even when they don't remember why." Grace had worn it since, never learning Sophia's surviving family's full names. Hospice charts by policy rarely followed her home. Marcus came back inside just as Lily finished speaking, his face draining of color for the second time that night. He recognized Grace instantly now, not from the dating app photo, but from a hospital hallway 14 months earlier, where a nurse in blue scrubs had once held his hand for exactly 90 seconds outside his wife's room and said nothing, because sometimes nothing was the only honest thing to say. "You were her nurse," he said, voice cracking. "I never got your name." The mutual friend who'd arranged the blind date, Marcus's co-worker Denise, hadn't known about the hospice connection, but she had known both Marcus and Grace separately for over 5 years, and had specifically thought of Grace when Marcus mentioned, months earlier at a work event, that he wished he could thank the nurse who'd cared for Sophia, but had lost track of everyone from that period entirely. Denise's matchmaking wasn't fate. It was one friend quietly trying to close a loop she didn't fully understand the shape of. Grace remembered more about Sophia's final week than she'd ever shared with anyone outside Marigold's clinical review process, including a detail she'd kept private out of professional caution. Sophia had asked Grace, in her last lucid conversation, to check on them sometimes, if you're ever able, referring to a husband and daughter Sophia worried wouldn't let themselves grieve properly. Grace had tried, twice, to locate them through the hospital's bereavement outreach program 8 months later, but privacy protocols and an outdated address had ended the search before it started. Marcus admitted, sitting down across from Grace for the first time that night, that he hadn't taken Lily to a single grief counseling session since Sophia's death, despite 2 separate referrals from her pediatrician and a documented 40% higher rate of prolonged childhood grief complications in children who don't receive early counseling support. He'd told himself he was protecting Lily from more clinical appointments. Grace gently suggested he'd actually been protecting himself from sitting in another waiting room. Lily, swinging her legs on the restaurant's cushioned bench, explained her mom replacement proposal with the devastating clarity only children manage. She didn't want a new mom to replace Sophia. She wanted someone who wouldn't disappear the way her mother had. Someone who already knew how to sit with sad things without flinching. A quality she'd apparently clocked in Grace within 4 minutes of watching her sit alone, abandoned at a table, without crying or leaving. Grace didn't become anyone's mother that night, and she was careful to say so gently to Lily, without dismissing the girl's instinct. What began instead was smaller and more deliberate. A coffee the following week, then a grief support session Marcus finally attended, at Grace's quiet suggestion, alongside Lily at a family bereavement program Marigold ran on Thursday evenings, one Grace had helped design 3 years earlier, but rarely got to see in action from the outside. 4 months into their slowly building friendship, Marcus found something he'd never had the courage to read. Sophia's hospice journal, returned to him in a memory box Marigold sends every family 6 months after a loss. In it, dated the same week as her final conversation with Grace, Sophia had written a description of the nurse with the bird pin she hoped Marcus might someday meet properly, not as a caregiver, but as herself. Sophia had seen something in Grace during 11 days of care that she'd hoped, without ever saying it fully aloud, might outlast her. Grace had spent 9 years keeping a careful professional distance from every family she cared for, a boundary she'd built after watching colleagues burn out from carrying grief that wasn't theirs to carry. Marcus and Lily were the first family to make her question whether that distance had protected her, or simply kept her as alone as the men who'd once left her table without explanation. She said yes to a 4th date, then a 10th. 2 years later, she said yes to a much bigger question, in the same restaurant, at the same corner table, with Lily, now 8, holding the ring box because she'd insisted on being the one to ask. Grace and Marcus married the following spring, and Grace formally adopted Lily 18 months later, a legal process Lily herself described, with characteristic bluntness, as official, but I already knew. Grace still wears the Wren pin. She added a second one to Lily's collar the day the adoption was finalized, a small, unbroken thread from a woman neither of them got to keep, to a family none of them expected to build from a rejected dinner reservation. The lesson isn't that heartbreak leads to happy endings on a schedule. It's that sometimes the people we lose leave behind exactly the right person to find the ones we love next. We just have to stay long enough at the table to let them arrive.